Hi, good afternoon, my 10th grade world history class. We are going to start today chapter 23. I'm not going to get very far in it today. I don't have any illusions of grandeur that we're going to cover the first 10 parts. No, we're just going to do a little bit. You can get your notes off of our Google Classroom page. Make sure you get those, because if you have them already written down, and then all you have to do is add in some of the things that maybe I tell you on the video, that will make those notes a little clearer for you. Should make it much easier to work with. And you also have an assignment on there about doing SRQs, okay, for this chapter. It's really quite a long chapter in this edition of your book. The Cold War is going to actually cover from 1945 into, I believe, the 1980s in this book, because our last chapter is taking us all the way into modern day, in the modern day world. So we really don't have that much more to go. If we finish the book, great. If we don't, I'm okay with that. But the Cold War era is a really interesting time of life. And I hope we get to enjoy some of the more interesting aspects of this together. All right, so let's talk a little bit about why we have a Cold War and what is a Cold War. Okay, so first of all, what is a Cold War as opposed to a hot war? I mean, and that really is what it is. A hot war would be, actual guns, tanks, weapons, hot war, okay? But a Cold War is when you're standing there face to face with another country. Neither one of you are using weapons, but neither is backing down, okay? So this is the way the world was from the 1940s into and through the 90s, the era of the Cold War. Okay, we're going to set our background here just a little bit. We have three different groups of nations, and every nation in the world falls into one of these three categories. The first is the industrialized nations. These are democratic nations that have a capitalistic economy, meaning that the people, private enterprise, owns the means of production. People own factories, businesses own factories, not the government, okay? The government does not control what is produced at all, okay? So industrialized nations, this would include the United States and most of Europe, okay? Then we have communist countries, and of course we know that at this time in history is Russia, which is now known as the USSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, China, and there was one other one. Why am I forgetting it? Most of Eastern Europe, not Western Europe, but Eastern Europe is communist at this point. We're going to talk a little bit about that today in just a minute. The third group of countries are called third world countries. And when we talk about third world countries today, most of the time we're saying that these countries are underdeveloped. They don't have enough industry to support the people. They're very poor countries, and that's kind of what we mean here. But probably more countries were considered third world during the Cold War than are today. These countries are not, in a communist country, you have a very controlled economy. The government owns the means of production. In industrialized, the private enterprise owns the means of production. In a third world country, these could be either a military dictatorship or a fledgling democracy where they're not real sure what they've got going on yet. And they could be toppled and controlled by outside sources. Okay, so those are our three groups of countries. Let's do a little bit more about what is going on here. That we have a heritage of mistrust. In other words, a heritage is a long history of not trusting each other, okay? So the United States at this point in history does not trust Russia, okay? Number one, Russia backed out of World War I and settled with Germany themselves. Then they made a non-aggression pact with Germany during World War II before they came to our side and the Allied side. So we have lots of reasons not to trust each other. It is the nature of communist governments not to trust other governments. Okay? It's in the nature. Okay? And that comes up with what we're going to look at as the communist motives for not trusting each other. Okay? So we're going to look at 3 communist motives for this Cold War. They are these. Excuse me, my nose itches so bad. The first is they were suspicious of the West. This is, as I said, part of the nature of communism. Communism takes over by force, and it is a government built on fear. And so it is, if you are afraid of your government, then you normally are afraid of other people as well. Okay. If you're afraid, for example, even today, if I'm afraid that my neighbors are going to report me to the government for having a party, I'm not going to have a party today because that would be a group of 10 or more. There are people like that in our world today, and we see some of that going on. So that is suspicious of the West. They just didn't trust each other. Right. The second one, though, is this communist ideology. And as you can see, some of these ideas overlap a little bit. Communist ideology is spread through violence. Okay. It is the natural method of spreading communism. It is what is demanded from their ideology, that they spread it through violence. If the rest of the world doesn't understand that communism is best for them, then we're going to conquer them so that they'll know it. Communism must dominate the world. That's kind of the idea. So that was behind some of this Soviet expansion in the Cold War era. And the third is just a desire for power. Russia really wanted to control all of Europe. And because of that desire for power, they are going to fight for every country they can get. So let's look at some of their expansionist policies. As I already said, the Soviets wanted to control all of Eastern Europe. They considered that their sphere of influence, the countries that they needed to be able to influence in order to control their own economy and to be able to spread communism as they saw fit. They also needed the resources of some of those Baltic states and the Eastern European states. They had more resources, believe it or not, than a lot of places in Russia do. So they wanted those as well. So they placed communists in power in many of these countries. Well, how did they do that? Well, through a variety of ways. Sometimes they took them by military force. They did this in Romania and in Poland and Bulgaria at the end of World War II. Sometimes they did it by infiltrating the governments or by subversion. They did that in Czechoslovakia and in Hungary, where the people elected their own government, what they thought was their own government. And then when the people get into power that they elected, they find out that those people are communists and they set up a communist government. They're also had, in some places, they actually had communists elected. In Albania and Yugoslavia, both, they had communists elected to power. So there were many different ways that communists were placed in power, but eventually they took over all of this area that you see on the map. They took over China, Mongolia. They also took over most of Eastern Europe. What they expressed in these areas was a virtual colonial control, similar to when Western Europe colonized most of the known world, when they colonized South America and North America and the Far East and the islands of the Pacific. They all, as colonies, they took all of the natural resources and left those countries poor. Well, the Soviets are going to do the exact same thing. They're going to exercise that very tight colonial type control. And revolts are going to be brutally crushed. especially in places like Hungary and Czechoslovakia. Soviet tanks would roll in and literally roll over people. In Hungary, it happened in 1956, and in Czechoslovakia in 1968. The Hungarian Revolution began in October of 1956, sparked by reports of mounting democratic and nationalistic protests in Poland. University students began protesting in the streets. By that evening, the streets and squares were filled with large crowds of workers, and a giant statue of Stalin was torn down. And that was, just the beginning of the end. October 31st, the leaders of the Soviet Politburo decided to reverse the policy of withdrawal and crush the revolt regardless of international pressure or opinion. They began to wipe out the resistance. Nearly 200,000 Hungarians had to flee the country into Austria or Yugoslavia, and they succeeded in crushing the revolt. That is all I want to go over today. Tomorrow we'll look at the American containment policy, how we're going to try to contain communism by basically like putting a lid on it like you would on a jar, and how do you contain communism and keep it from spreading around to the rest of the world. Okay, that's all I have for today, but I do have one interesting fact for you to use on your quiz. If you've listened this far, make sure you are ready for this. A group of unicorns is called a blessing. So you can literally have a blessing of unicorns. I'm not sure why you need to know that, but that's your thought for the day. Okay? All right. I'll see you tomorrow.